If you have your Bibles, turn to Ephesians chapter 6. This morning we're looking at verses 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Ephesians chapter 6, starting with verse 5. Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your master according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord, and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. Now, as we pursue what Paul is talking about in this text, we need to remember that in Rome, at the time Paul was writing, there were probably 60 million slaves. You remember that as the Romans conquered nation after nation, they took a lot of people slaves, took them back to Rome, and they became slaves. Well, apparently the Romans were somewhat selective in who they chose to save as slaves. And they chose people who had talents, who had abilities, who had skills. They were the ones that the Romans took back to Rome as slaves. In fact, almost all the work that was done in Rome in the early couple of hundred years of the Christian dispensation was done by slaves. All skilled labor was done mostly by slaves. Even professionals were slaves. Slavery was totally different in Rome in those days than what we know of as slavery here in the United States a couple of hundred years ago. Paul is not actually criticizing slavery. He's not condemning it or condoning it. But he is dealing with the tension that arises when a slave becomes a Christian. And there were so many slaves that probably in the early church there were a lot of Christians who were slaves. And Paul is dealing with the tension that arises between the obligations of a person who is free in Christ Jesus, who is not free to his earthly master. At first thought, we may say this doesn't have much application to us today because none of us are slaves. Well, maybe we are slaves. Think of it this way. If because of economic constraint, in other words, you don't have enough money on your own, you have to work for a living, you are actually selling your body and your mind to your employer. You work out some kind of an agreement, and according to that agreement, you are obligated to your employer for, say, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week. You are obligated to carry out their wishes. So, in a sense, you sell yourself as a slave anytime you accept employment. You are that employer's slave for that time and period. Now, Paul is saying if you find yourself in this situation, and most all of us have been in that situation, because not many of us are financially independent. We have to work to earn a living. He says if you find yourself in this tension between obligations to your employer and your obligations to Jesus, this message is for you. This is who I'm talking to, Paul says. Probably there's no better example of what Paul is trying to communicate than Joseph in the Old Testament. He is an excellent example of a man who is free in God. He's a dedicated, God-fearing man, yet he still is a slave. Even before he became a slave, he was very obedient to his father. He was quick to obey. When his father sent him to look for his brothers who were taking care of the sheep, he went instantly. As he wound up a slave in Egypt, serving Potiphar, Joseph was very, very efficient. He did his dead level best to fulfill the wishes of his earthly master. Even when he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, Joseph was faithful to Potiphar. He marched to a different drummer than most of his fellow slaves. Then he was sent to prison unjustly. And even in prison, he there again continued to be a good employee, a good worker. He applied himself with diligence to doing everything he could do for others. And as a result, he became trusted as the second in command of the prison under the warden. And then finally, he was promoted to be the second in command of all of Egypt. All because he was very, very careful to serve his masters, earthly masters, as if he was serving God himself. I'm sure many of you could tell experiences a whole lot better than what's happened to me. But I thought of an experience I had one time about doing your best, serving God as you serve your employer. I was in college in Lincoln, Nebraska, in the winter of, I don't know what year it was, 55, 56, I guess it's 56, 57, somewhere in there. Had a great snowstorm. And the railroad yards in Lincoln were all snowed under. They couldn't even make up a train because the switches were all covered up in snow. So the railroad hired a bunch of college students. There were 3 colleges in Lincoln at the time. Hired a bunch of college students to come in and shovel snow away from the switches and the tracks so that the train crew could make up their trains. Now, I was one of those who took a chance to make this extra money. We were hired to work from 1 o'clock until 5 o'clock. 4 hours is what we was contracted to do. We were supposed to work 4 hours. And so we went to work. And I wasn't paying that much of attention, but I think I was aware. I don't remember now, but anyway, as it began to get close to 5 o'clock, quitting time, all of the other college students began to work their way back to the starting point, quitting spot. And so at 5 o'clock, I don't know, 15 or 20 students had worked their way back to the starting point to be paid. All except one. I was a quarter mile down the track still shoveling snow. I was contracted to work until 5 o'clock. I worked until 5 o'clock. I shoveled snow up until the clock said 5 o'clock before I quit. And so here I am, a quarter of a mile down the railroad track. All the rest of them are gathered around waiting to be paid. And the railroad agent made them all stand there and wait until I made my way through the snow, a quarter of a mile back to the starting point. It took me 10 minutes or so. They had to wait. When I got there, I was standing on sort of the back of all the group because they'd all been standing around up close waiting to be paid. I was at the rear. And then the railroad agent said, "We need one of you to stay by, and we'll pay you time and a half, and you'll ride a switch engine. And we want you there just in case a switch doesn't respond and freezes up, and you can get off and clear the switch, and so the train crew doesn't have to do it. Would any of you be interested in working for a few hours at time and a half, just riding the switch engine in case the switch freezes up?" Every hand went up, including mine. Guess who got the job? If you were the employee, who would you have hired? The one who worked until 5 o'clock. It pays to work as if you are working for God. You reap benefits here, but it does something to you personally. Human nature hasn't changed really much since the days of the Apostle Paul and today. So I'm sure that slaves in the days of Paul were like employees today. Well, okay, I'll obey and I'll do what I'm told to do, but I don't have to like it. And I don't have to work any harder than I have to. I'll do just enough to get by. Don't expect me to put my heart into it. Paul knew that some of the slaves might be thinking thoughts like this. Grace and I had the opportunity of visiting the Ukraine, country of Ukraine, just after communism fell, and the Ukrainians had freedom. We found a different culture there in the Ukraine. It seems that for the years that they had been subjected to communism, they had developed a mentality: I have to do what they tell me to do, but I don't have to do a dime's worth of work more than that. Just enough so that I'll get in trouble. And so the mentality of employees in Ukraine when we were there was, don't do a thing that you don't have to do. Don't put forth any extra effort, because all these folk who are above you have been taking advantage of you for years. And so they had a work mentality that was like a lot of employees today. I do just enough to keep from getting fired. Now, Paul says here in verses 5 and 6, that he says in verse 5, he says, we must serve our earthly masters, our earthly employers, with fear and trembling. See that? Fear and trembling. Well, of course, you can see why a slave might feel this way, because if they disobeyed, they might get beaten, whipped. They might be sold, or they might even be killed. So you can see why a slave might be a little bit terrified. How about employees today? There is a culture in some. Well, let's take, for instance, government employees. Their job security. Job security sounds good, but it works against productivity for a lot of employees. They've got job security so they don't have to put forth any great effort. They don't have to ply themselves. I think it's important to have some sense of job security. But I also think that employees need to know that they need to perform. They need to produce. They need to be worth what they're being paid to do. There's always a possibility that for most of us we could be fired if we're not productive. Through the years, I've had several interns, young ministerial students, graduating, and they usually are sent to work with a seasoned pastor for a few months or maybe a year or so before they are given a church to pastor. And I've had a number of young men serve under me as interns for the ministry. I was just the other day going back over and looking at the different men that had worked with me as interns over the years. And about half of them, I recommended that they be fired. Only about half of the men that have worked with me as interns have I recommended to enter the ministry. I had one intern that I couldn't even trust him to go preach in a church. He was just totally undependable. I couldn't expect him to perform any assigned task like he's supposed to. He didn't last long with me. Today I understand that most employers have a 3-month period, a probationary period. They hire you, and at the end of 3 months they decide whether they keep you or don't keep you. I was visiting with a young man in Phoenix who had a BA degree in business administration. He had a master's degree in finance. He had 2 master's degrees, another one in something related to finance and accounting. But he couldn't hold a job. He could work for 3 months. At the end of the probationary period, they let him go. He was living off of his inheritance. His father left him some money. But the time I was visiting with him, his inheritance was just about gone. And he had no job. He just couldn't seem to work satisfactorily with anybody that hired him. He just couldn't hold a job. They let him go. He told me one day, he said, I am not going to live on the street. That's all he said. Next time I went to see him, he was gone. Where he went, I have no idea. Whether he went out in the desert and killed himself, I don't know. Maybe you're working for somebody who is unkind. Maybe you're working for somebody who's incompetent. Some people are promoted one step above their competency level. You may be in one of those situations. And you may be tempted to take advantage of the situation. But Paul is saying, look, you are to work as if you're working for Jesus. He is your main employer. He is your main master. encouraged my children as they were growing up when they got a part-time job somewhere. Always do more than expected. If they hire you to work 4 hours, give them full 4 hours. Don't cheat them. Paul's idea here is that we see our work, our employment, as not just being employed by a man or a human being. We are really working for Jesus. Our religion is not just a one-day-a-week business, but our religion should permeate our attitude all through the week. One thing that in this text that's a little challenging is Paul says there in verse 5, work in sincerity of heart. You wonder, what does he mean by sincerity of heart? He means that when you hire yourself out to do something, do it sincerely with the utmost of your ability, to the best of your ability. Do your very best. Paul is saying to the slaves, it's not just your outward actions that I'm interested in. I'm interested in inward attitude. What is your inward attitude? Do you do it resentfully? Do you do it reluctantly? Or do you carry out your instructions sincerely with a right attitude? I'm going to do it the very best I can do it. Before I went to college to study for the ministry, I was working for the Kansas City Southern Railway Company. I had been working for a railroad in Texas. Kansas City Southern Railway Company hired me to come to Kansas City to work as a claim investigator. I was 24, 23, 24, I don't. Anyway, they hired me to be a claim investigator. So I went to Kansas City, didn't know a soul up there, and I found that there were 3 other claim investigators. I was one of 4 claim investigators. Okay, fine. I went up there to work. I wasn't aware at the time, in my youth and nativity, I didn't realize that most of the employees, all of the employees were members of the of the railroad union, and the union had a certain amount of protection, job security, and so most of the employees weren't working at their full capacity. And apparently the other investigators realized that I was putting out more claims than they were. So one of the men came over to talk to me one day, and he told me some far-fetched story about a man standing looking out the window, but he took out his handkerchief and once in a while he'd wipe the window, and he got by with it because he could claim he was cleaning the window. But basically he was just standing there looking out the window. I didn't know what he was trying to tell me. It didn't register in my young mind that he was telling me to slow down. Well, I hadn't worked at the Kansas City Southern Railway Company for about less than a year, and a job opened up in the auditing department. A big salary boost over claim investigators. Well, I didn't apply for it because, man, I didn't even have a year's seniority there. And I knew that some of the people around there who had 20, 25 years seniority were applying for the job. So I paid no attention to it. But one day the auditor was walking around talking to different people, and he made his way by my desk, and in a low voice, so that nobody else could hear it, he said, "You know that job that's open? Yeah. That position that's open." He said, "Would you be interested?" And I said, "Well, sure, I'd like to. It'd be fun." He says, apply. So I applied. There was no way in the world that they were going to buck 20 years seniority, 25 years seniority to hire a man that's only been in the office there for less than a year. But guess what? I got the job. At 24, I'm making more money than people who've worked in that railroad office for 25, 30 years. Why? Because I worked. I put my heart into it. I wanted to do as much or a little more than expected. This is what Paul is encouraging us to do as employees. Put yourself into it. Give it your best, because remember, you're not working for a men, you're not working for human beings, you're working for Jesus. So the message of Paul to all employees, whatever you may be hiring yourself out to do, Paul's counsel can be summarized in just 4 words. Do your best for Jesus. You're working for Jesus, not human beings. You're not doing it to please men, you're doing it to please God. Over and over again in these 3 verses, Paul is saying, we don't work for men, we work for Jesus, we work for Christ. Just look at, in the end of verse 5 there, it says, as to Christ. In verse 6, bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God. Verse 7, as to the Lord. You see, over and over again, Paul is saying in these 3 verses that we need to keep in mind that God is holding us accountable for the way we work, for our attitude at work, for our sincerity at work. The main reason is because Jesus wants the world to know that Him in our hearts makes a difference. Having Christ in our lives changes us. We're different kind of employees. He wants the world to realize that we have a master in heaven, and He's the one we're anxious to please. Actually, if you could just see your earthly employment as a form of ministry, because the way you work is a reflection upon your God. And Paul is encouraging these people who were slaves, but in a sense, all employees are slaves in a sense. He's encouraging all of us to reflect our religion in the way we go about our work. Well, let's look at verse 9. Ephesians 6 and verse 9, Paul now turns his attention toward the employers. And he says, you masters, or you employers, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. So Paul is telling employers, remember, God is holding you accountable for the way you treat your employees. God is holding you accountable for the way you go about your work. Employers today have the same problems that employees do. A lot of contractors, a lot of employers, when they accept a job, they look at how to get the most bucks out of that job with the least amount of effort. If inspectors are not watching them, they won't put rebar in the foundation, in the concrete. If the inspector's not watching them, they'll use the wrong kind of nails or screws. Anything to save a dime here and to save a dime there. Some employers even tell their employees, if you go out and inspect somebody's furnace, if you can sell them a new furnace, I'll give you the commission, and you'll make a whole lot more money than if you just fix their furnace. All kinds of things go on today. And so Paul is telling employers as well as employees, do your work as if you're doing it for Christ. We're not all created equal. Sad but true. Some people are created ability to rise above the ordinary and become employers. Some people have the ability to be leaders. And some people don't have that same qualification. We're all different. There's always going to be employers, bosses, and there's going to be employees and workers. That's the way God has designed this planet to run. We need each other. Great leaders need people to lead. Big projects need workers who get down and do the grunt work stuff. So everybody's needed. Those who can manage and those who can't. But we all have one overriding purpose in life, and that is to do our best for Jesus. I can't guarantee you job promotions. I can't permit you salary increases. But I can guarantee you one thing. God is not partial. He's going to reward each one of us according to the attitude that we have manifested in our day-by-day work. Not just Sabbath, not just how we keep the Sabbath, but God is going to reward us according to the way we have lived for Him 7 days a week.